Racism isn't just a problem we read about in history books, it's alive and well today, showing up in the most unexpected places. What would you do if you were publicly humiliated for something you couldn't control? Have you ever been in a situation where the color of your skin decided your fate? Imagine standing in front of a room full of strangers, facing insults, rejection, and embarrassment, and then, something happens that changes everything. Before we dive into this powerful story, tell me, where are you watching from? Let me know the city you're in. Is it New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, or somewhere else? Stay with us until the end, and make sure you subscribe to Behind the Billions for more powerful stories that inspire change. The evening at the Sterling Club was meant to be nothing less than perfect, a sophisticated night for the elite of Manhattan. The restaurant was buzzing with activity, tables set with fine china, crystal glasses filled with wine, and an orchestra playing softly in the background. Tiffany, a young black woman, stood among the staff, her posture professional and poised. Dressed in a crisp black vest, white shirt, and a white apron, she looked every bit the part of a dedicated server. Yet, her nervousness was palpable. She had worked tirelessly to secure this position at one of the most prestigious restaurants in the city, knowing that her every action would be under scrutiny. Her eyes scanned the room, taking in the clinking of glasses and the quiet chatter of the guests, but there was no time to admire the ambience, duty called. As Tiffany approached a table in the far corner, her heart skipped a beat. At the center of the table was a well-dressed woman in a stunning navy blue dress. The woman was already frowning, her arms crossed as she eyed Tiffany, waiting for her to take the drink order. Tiffany took a deep breath, smiled, and politely asked, "Good evening, ma'am. Can I start you off with a drink?" Without a word, the woman scowled and waved her hand dismissively. "You're already late, and now this," she barked, pointing to the coffee cup Tiffany had just served. The hot drink had spilled slightly over the edge of the cup, leaving a small stain on the woman's pristine dress. Tiffany immediately apologized, her voice soft but sincere. "I'm so sorry, ma'am, let me clean that up for you." She bent down to grab a napkin, but the woman was far from forgiving. "What kind of service is this?" she snapped, her voice growing louder with each passing second. The atmosphere shifted as the woman's temper flared. She stood up abruptly, knocking her chair backward. The room fell silent as the other patrons glanced nervously toward the table, sensing the impending explosion. Tiffany stood frozen, trying to find the right words, but none came. She was trapped in a moment of humiliation that was beginning to unfold like an unstoppable force. The woman continued her tirade, her voice now echoing through the room, drawing attention to Tiffany, who stood helpless, her face flushed with embarrassment. The woman's words rang out with cutting disdain, "Are you even qualified to work here? Look at you, incapable of serving a simple cup of coffee. You've ruined my evening, and I demand that you fix this. Now." As Tiffany began to back away, feeling the weight of the scornful glares from every direction, the tension in the room was thick. The woman's ranting reached its peak, with the entire dining room now watching this scene unfold. The tension in the air was thick as Tiffany, still reeling from the public outburst, made her way to the back of the restaurant. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her hands trembled as she grabbed a damp cloth to wipe away the stain from her apron. She could still hear the woman's harsh words echoing in her mind, drowning out the other sounds of the bustling restaurant. Tiffany had grown up being taught to rise above the prejudices of the world, but tonight, it felt like the weight of the world was bearing down on her. Moments later, Robert Sterling, the owner of the Sterling Club, entered the kitchen, his sharp gaze scanning the room. Tiffany looked up from where she was scrubbing the counter, her hands still shaking. "Tiffany," Robert called her name firmly, causing her to stiffen. "Come with me." Tiffany followed him, trying to keep her composure as she walked behind him into the main dining area. Her stomach churned with nervous anticipation. Was she about to be fired? Her thoughts were racing, this was the moment she had feared. Robert was an imposing figure, tall, impeccably dressed in a dark suit, and the kind of person who didn't tolerate failure. She had seen him in action, commanding respect from both the staff and the guests, but tonight, it felt like she was standing on the edge of her own personal abyss. As they reached the table where the incident had occurred, the woman was still seated, her arms crossed tightly across her chest, a look of entitlement plastered across her face. She had calmed down somewhat but still held a sharp, resentful gaze. "Robert, thank you for dealing with this," the woman said sweetly, now adopting a softer tone, her smile insincere. "This young woman has been an embarrassment to your restaurant. You should consider letting her go." Robert turned to Tiffany. His expression was impassive, but the coldness in his eyes felt like a slap. "Tiffany," he said in a tone that made her stomach drop, "I think it's best you step away from the floor for the night." The words hit her like a blow. She could feel the sting of rejection settle into her bones. She had expected support, maybe even an apology for the way she was treated, but instead, she was being cast aside as if she were disposable. "I'm sorry, Robert," Tiffany stammered, trying to keep the tears at bay. "I'll clean up and—" "No, that won't be necessary," Robert interrupted, his voice colder than ever. "Just head to the back. We'll take care of things here." Tiffany's heart ached as she turned and walked away, her legs feeling heavy with each step. She had always thought that hard work would be enough to overcome the challenges she faced, but tonight, it felt like that belief had been shattered. The very man who owned the restaurant, the man she had looked up to, had just abandoned her in the most humiliating way possible. As she disappeared behind the kitchen door, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just been abandoned by the very system she had trusted. The oppressive silence of the dining room pressed in on her, and the sting of public shaming still burned deep within her. The following hours dragged on in a blur of quiet murmurs and clinking plates as Tiffany hid away in the kitchen, her mind spinning. She replayed every moment of the confrontation over and over in her head, the sting of the woman's words, Robert's cold dismissal, and the hopelessness she had felt as she walked away from the scene. It felt like the world was conspiring to make her feel small, invisible. Her once proud position at the Sterling Club now felt like a distant memory, replaced by the crushing weight of rejection. But little did Tiffany know, the worst of the night was far from over. As the restaurant began to quiet down for the evening, Robert Sterling came back into the kitchen. This time, his expression was different, more deliberate. He stood there for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts, before calling her name. Tiffany looked up from the counter where she was absent-mindedly wiping a dish, her hands still trembling. "Tiffany," Robert said softly, his voice steady. "I need to speak with you." A mix of fear and confusion gripped her chest. She stood up, wiping her hands on a towel, and followed him back into the dining area. The tension was thick, the restaurant had emptied out, leaving only a few lingering guests and the faint hum of quiet conversations in the background. "Sit down," Robert said, his tone still serious. Tiffany hesitated, her heart beating rapidly, but she obeyed, sitting at one of the tables near the center. Her mind raced, was this going to be the official end of her career here? Robert sat down opposite her, his eyes softening as he studied her. "What happened earlier, what you experienced, that was wrong. But there's something I should have told you a long time ago. Something that changes everything." Tiffany blinked, unsure of what he meant. Her breath caught in her throat as she waited for him to continue, her mind unable to connect the dots. "I know I've been distant, and you've probably felt unsupported," he said, looking at her with a mixture of regret and determination. "But the truth is, Tiffany, you're not just an employee here. You're my daughter." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Tiffany froze, her mind struggling to process what he had just said. She stared at Robert, her eyes wide, the room suddenly feeling suffocating. Her father? The man who had watched from the sidelines, never stepping in to defend her, was her father. What? Tiffany stammered, her voice barely a whisper, a mix of shock and disbelief. "You're my father. But why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you stand up for me earlier when that woman humiliated me? You let me take the fall." Robert sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. I was afraid. I was afraid of how people would view me, how they would view you. You're my daughter, Tiffany, and I knew that being associated with you, a black woman, would be a point of contention for some. But that's no excuse for the way I've treated you. I've failed you, and for that, I'm truly sorry. Tiffany's mind spun. Everything she had believed about her position here, everything she had worked for, suddenly seemed like an illusion. She had always wondered why she didn't get the support she needed, why Robert had remained distant. Now, it made sense, but it didn't make it any easier to swallow. She had been standing at the edge of success, but instead, she had been pushed aside, left to fend for herself. You've been ashamed of me, Tiffany finally said, her voice shaking. You let me go through this whole ordeal because you were worried about how it would look to other people. I thought you would be the one who'd protect me from this. Robert's face softened with guilt. I didn't know how to handle it, Tiffany. I should have been there for you. I've let my own fear take over my actions, and that's something I'm deeply ashamed of. Tiffany shook her head, fighting back the tears that were threatening to fall. I needed you tonight, and you weren't there. You stood by, and I was left to face the consequences of someone else's prejudice alone. The silence between them was heavy. Tiffany's mind was reeling, still unable to fully grasp the gravity of the situation. But there was one thing she knew for sure, this wasn't just about the restaurant. This was about a father who had kept his identity hidden, who had allowed his daughter to endure racism and disrespect without stepping in. You've let me down, Tiffany whispered, standing up to leave. I thought I could count on you. But now, I don't know who you are. As she turned to walk away, Robert's voice stopped her. Tiffany, please, let me make this right. But Tiffany didn't look back. She needed time, space, and most of all, clarity. The truth had been revealed, but it only raised more questions. Who was Robert Sterling, really? And who was Tiffany in the eyes of the world? What did it mean to be a daughter in a world that saw race before family? She didn't have the answers, but tonight, she would find them, on her own terms. The silence in the restaurant was palpable. Tiffany stood in the back, her thoughts swirling as she fought the urge to collapse. The weight of Robert's revelation hung heavily on her shoulders, and her mind struggled to reconcile the man she thought she knew with the truth he had just shared. She had been abandoned, humiliated, and left to fend for herself, all while carrying the weight of her father's secret. The conflict inside her raged, and the exhaustion was almost too much to bear. But that night, something inside her shifted. She would no longer be the silent observer of her own life. As she walked back toward the front of the restaurant, her mind raced with everything that had happened. But what really burned her was the way she had been treated, the way Robert had allowed her to be disrespected. It wasn't just about the spilled coffee or the woman's cruel words anymore. It was about the deeper issue, the systemic racism she had been forced to endure in silence. As Tiffany approached the dining area, she could see the angry woman still seated at the table, her arms crossed tightly in a show of defiance. The woman had clearly not forgiven her for the incident, and now she was sitting with a smug sense of satisfaction, as if she had won. Tiffany's blood began to boil. The injustice of it all was suffocating. Robert, having followed her into the dining area, looked tense but composed. He glanced at Tiffany, his eyes betraying the weight of the earlier conversation. Tiffany, he said softly, stepping forward to face the woman who had caused so much turmoil. I need to address this. The woman, seeing Robert approach, stood up quickly. She sneered, her tone dripping with arrogance. I hope you're going to do something about this disaster, Robert, she said, eyes flashing with self-righteousness. This girl has no place here. I demand that you fire her right now. Tiffany's heart raced as she heard the words, but something inside her snapped. This wasn't just a confrontation with the woman at the table, it was everything that had built up over the years, the racial injustice, the feeling of being overlooked and underestimated. Robert, sensing the rising tension, turned to Tiffany, his eyes still soft but now tinged with guilt. "Tiffany," he said gently, "I'm sorry about everything that's happened, but this isn't the right way to handle things." Tiffany's emotions surged, the sting of betrayal fresh in her chest. "No, Robert," she said sharply, her voice trembling but steady. "You don't get to apologize for what happened and then stand here, letting her tell you what to do. I've worked hard for every inch of this job. You never stood up for me, and now you want me to just accept your apology." Robert looked at her, his gaze filled with regret. But Tiffany wasn't finished. She turned to face the woman who had belittled her so publicly, her voice rising with a newfound strength. "You think you can walk in here, humiliate me, and then demand that I be fired like I'm nothing?" "Well, I'm not nothing," Tiffany said, her words like daggers. "I'm more than just a waiter to you. I'm a person with dignity, and you don't get to strip that away from me just because you think you're better." The woman's face flushed with anger, her mouth opening in an attempt to fire back, but Tiffany didn't give her the chance. "You want to see what real service is? Real service is respecting people, no matter who they are or where they come from. It's not about being rude or entitled. It's about recognizing humanity. And you," Tiffany paused, her eyes hardening. "You need to learn that." The woman stood frozen for a moment, clearly not expecting Tiffany to stand up to her in such a way. Robert, still caught in the crossfire, watched as the two women faced off, his daughter, speaking her truth, and the entitled customer, slowly realizing that she no longer had the upper hand. "Well, I never," the woman started, but Robert interrupted her, his tone now as firm as Tiffany's. "That's enough," Robert said, stepping between them. He turned to the woman with an icy stare. "You've been rude and disrespectful to my staff, and most importantly, to my daughter. You're no longer welcome here." The woman's eyes widened in disbelief, and for the first time that night, she seemed unsure of herself. She had expected to control the narrative, to have Robert kowtow to her demands. But instead, he stood his ground. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I suggest you leave," Robert said, his voice brokering no argument. The woman hesitated for a moment, clearly seething, but she gathered her things and stormed out of the restaurant, muttering under her breath. The other patrons, who had witnessed the confrontation, remained silent, unsure of how to react. Tiffany stood in place, her body trembling with adrenaline. She had done it, she had confronted the woman who had shamed her, and in the process, she had found a piece of herself that had been buried under years of oppression. As the door closed behind the woman, Tiffany turned to Robert, her gaze still filled with a mix of anger and disbelief. "You should have done that sooner," she said quietly. Robert met her eyes, his face etched with guilt. "I know. And I'm sorry it took me so long." But Tiffany wasn't listening to his apology anymore. She had won this battle, not because of him, but because of herself. And for the first time that night, she felt a spark of hope. In the days that followed the confrontation, the atmosphere at the Sterling Club shifted. The restaurant, once a place of quiet elegance and unspoken tension, now carried an undercurrent of change. The media caught wind of the dramatic events that had unfolded, and the story of Tiffany's public shaming spread across social platforms. The tale of a young black woman being humiliated by an entitled customer, only to have her billionaire father finally stand up for her, resonated deeply with people across the country. It wasn't just about the restaurant, it was about a larger issue of systemic racism and the power dynamics at play in everyday life. Tiffany's courage and strength were becoming symbols of resistance. She had been knocked down, humiliated, and cast aside, but instead of succumbing to it, she had stood tall and fought back. Her defiance, her refusal to accept the status quo, was something people admired. Tiffany's name began to circulate among those who had been victims of similar injustices, her story inspiring others to stand up for themselves when no one else would. As the restaurant's new day began, Tiffany walked into work with her head held high. Gone was the timid, nervous woman who had entered that very establishment months ago. Today, she stood as a force to be reckoned with, confident, strong, and unapologetically herself. She was no longer defined by the shame of that moment, she was now the author of her own story. Robert was waiting for her in the front. He had been watching the unfolding events from the background, quietly acknowledging the shift in public perception. While he still bore the weight of his own guilt for not supporting his daughter sooner, he knew that this was her victory, not his. Tiffany had become a symbol, not just for the fight against racism but for resilience in the face of adversity. "Good morning, Tiffany," Robert said, his voice filled with a mixture of pride and regret. "I know things haven't been easy, and I can never undo the mistakes I've made. But I want you to know something." Tiffany turned to face him, her gaze steady. "You don't need to apologize anymore, Robert. I've moved past that. I'm not here for your apology. I'm here for me, for my future." Robert nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "You're right. And I want you to know that from now on, I'll be supporting you in every way I can. You've earned your place here, Tiffany. You don't need anyone's permission to be who you are." Tiffany smiled faintly. "It's not about earning a place here, Robert. It's about knowing that I deserve respect, no matter where I am or who I'm with. And now, more than ever, I'm going to make sure that's the standard." That afternoon, as the restaurant began to fill with customers once again, Tiffany found herself in a new role, not just as an employee but as a leader. Her interactions with her colleagues had changed. They now looked at her with a mix of admiration and respect. They knew that she had fought for her place, not just in the restaurant but in the world. Tiffany wasn't going to let anyone push her around anymore. The woman who had humiliated her no longer mattered. She was a distant memory, just another face in the crowd of the many who had tried to bring her down. Tiffany wasn't focused on the past anymore. She was looking forward, and the future seemed brighter than ever. "Tiff.